Vendor groups. So what kind of groups of vendors you have in business usually? How do you group your vendors? Any idea? Based on the services or the goods delivered by the vendors, you can group your vendors. Based on where the vendors are located, for that also you can group them. So like within the state vendors, out of the state vendors, domestic vendors, then you say foreign vendors, then you can differentiate the vendors like that: local vendors, domestic vendors, and foreign vendors. Right? Some people will also create employees as vendors in the companies, just like for just to create the payroll invoices against them and to make payments to them. So they'll just create vendors, employees also as vendors in the business. So that group also you can create. Or so just like as I was saying, there can be different types of grouping or categorization. Local vendors, you can say like domestic vendors, foreign vendors. So this is one kind of categorization. So other than this, we have another way like, so depending on the product that is delivered by the vendor. Suppose vendors are delivering electrics normally, electric vendors or electronics vendors, you can say. Then raw material vendors who would usually deliver the raw material for you. In that raw material, if you have categories like spare parts or something like direct B2B deliveries, so you can categorize them again. Electronics vendors, raw material vendors, service vendors, tax vendors. Tax vendors means the actually we'll create tax authorities as vendors again. So for them we can give tax vendors. You can also group employees into a segment of vendors. So it's up to you. You can group your vendors in any way as you require. So this vendor group generally gives you certain details or certain options by default, which you can give to the group at group level. So if you give that group level, it will be assigned to all the vendors that are created in that particular vendor group. So normally when we create a vendor, we will select one vendor group to be assigned to that vendor, so that all the default details on the vendor group will be reflecting on the vendor directly. So that's how we can group the vendors. So let's see how we can create vendors in vendor group in Reliance company. So for that, I'll take you to accounts payable module here. In the accounts payable module under vendors in the first menu, I can see vendor groups here. So accounts payable, vendors, vendor groups here. So I'll create vendor groups, click on vendor groups. So as earlier while I was demonstrating you, to make the vendor payments, so I have configured this domestic vendors as a group. So I'll also add one more like 02 foreign vendors. I can also create one more 03 like local vendors. So for each group, you can give a default terms of payment. So this concept of terms of payment we'll discuss in our next classes, coming classes. Okay. So terms of payment is like how many days of time that the vendor allows normally once the invoice is posted. So if the invoice is being done for today's date, he will give you net 30 days time, suppose, which means you can make the payment in 30 days starting from today. In that way, like net 2 days, net 3 days, you will can have different terms of payments as well. So that can be mentioned here. If you want configured, you can mention your terms of payment here. Then you will have time between invoice due date and payment date. So normally terms of payment indicates the due date for the invoice. So you can give some spare time, grace period, like another 2 days or 3 days if the vendor is allowing you, or that set of vendors are allowing you, that group of vendors are allowing you another grace period. You can add another net 2 days here if you want to. That will be reflecting onto the vendors automatically whenever I create a vendor and link this group to the vendor. Okay, you can also give a default sales tax group to the vendors. So whenever I give a default sales tax group to the group of vendors, and when I create individual vendors and link the group, automatically this sales tax group will be populating onto the vendors master that I create or the vendor record that I create. Okay. However, you can override it in the vendor level if you want to. It's not a problem. But when you give the details on the group level, so they will be automatically picked onto the uh, vendor creation whenever when we create vendors and link the vendor groups. Okay, we have one more option here called as exclude from search results. Means I think if I select this option, you might not create be available. This group might not be available for creation of vendors again or until I untick this one. So I don't want users to create any vendor in this particular group for suppose. So I will say that exclude from search results means it won't be visible again for them for creation of a vendor. When creating a vendor, they can only see these two groups, but they cannot see this group, local vendors, because I have regulated the users to not to create any vendor in the local vendors. So that's how. So if I would show you the same menu in the other legal entity, like in USMF, they would have different kind of differentiation for their vendors. So I'll just show you the same in. So it's not saved here and refresh. That's okay. Let me change the company to USMF. So here it is. They have differentiated it in a different way. They have given numbering as 1, 2, 3, 4 like this. Parts vendors, service vendors, tax authorities, other vendors, intercompany vendors. So this again depends on the business. So what kind of business it is. If it is a manufacturing, you find these kind of vendors maybe. If it is a service sector, you might have different vendors. Like if suppose if it is a hospital industry, you will have different vendor groups like medical equipment vendors who would normally sell you the medical equipment, pharma vendors who would sell you the pharma goods. Then you might have electronics vendors who would deliver you the electronics, furniture vendors, non-medical vendors, medical vendors you have. So some people in the medical industry also create doctors as the vendors. So whatever the doctors and employees they have, they create them as vendors so that they can generate checks against them or make payments to them whenever required. And those details can be saved in the accounts payable module. So that can be also done. So grouping the vendors again depends. So when you are going to a client place for when you are implementing a project, so you would ask them how you are maintaining your vendors or how you are separating your vendors or grouping your vendors. Provide the details and we will implement the same in Dynamics according to your wish or according to the categories that you are following. We will also create the vendor groups as so. So these are the terms of payments actually that we will discuss in the next classes. So here you can see net 30 days is the terms of payment. There is another net 10 days as the grace period here being allowed here for the vendors. So due date will be after 30 days of posting the invoice. There will be another 10 days additional as a grace period to make the payment so that we can give such kind of details of default details for the group here. Okay. So this is how vendor groups are created. So we have 3 vendor groups created now in Reliance. So we can proceed with the next configuration of the creation of vendors. Okay. So I'll go to this tab now. So I'll generally go back to the same in Reliance, change the company back to Reliance. So I can see 3 vendor groups here. So for creation of vendors, actually you have to go to accounts payable module. And in that you have all vendors here. Accounts payable, all vendors. So I'll create one vendor, all vendors. So I have already created a vendor called as Tata Company. For making this check payments and all. Here it is. So we have some vendor called as Reliance 0000001, but I don't want it in this way. I want vendor 001, vendor 002 like that. While I was in a hurry that day, I have created in this way. I can change the rename it if I want to. Any record in Dynamics, I can rename it. It will entirely change the details of it in the database completely, but it will take some time. We have that option here called as rename record in the record info. But I don't prefer to do this actually. Most of the times clients don't prefer because there can be chances of data corruption if it is not properly done or if you have cancelled it in between while it is running. So it might give you some trouble. So you can click this option of rename. So earlier it was like Reliance 0001, right? I'll give the same here. Just change it to vendor 000001. Okay, I'll just click on OK. So it is asking, are you sure you want to rename it? I'll say yes. Normally in business, they can follow this one series only for all the vendors. All the vendors means for all the vendors of any group, like local vendors or domestic vendors or foreign vendors, they'll number them as vendor 001, vendor 002, vendor 003. So there is a chance for automatic numbering, but most of them will opt to number their vendors manually. They don't want the automatic numbers for the vendors because we only have one number sequence for the vendors. But some people want to number their vendors according to the group of the vendor. Suppose if it is a local vendor, they will give it as LOC VEN 0001, suppose. And domestic means DOM VEN 0001. Foreign means FOR VEN 0001. Like that, they can number them or in that format separately for each vendor group. So most of them I have seen they maintain it manually or separately for each vendor group. Okay, they will see the number or they'll see the list of vendors they have. They'll create a next vendor with they'll create a next vendor manually with the next number that they will assign manually. Suppose if the vendor number is FRVEN 00099. So they'll create next number as 00100. So after the number, the next number they'll manually assign. But you have this option of automatic assignment also, but it will give you the single number only. You can't give different numbers to the different vendor groups again. So if you use the single number option, so normally that number sequence option will be in accounts payable. Under setup we have parameters, accounts payable parameters. In the accounts payable parameters, we have that option. So it will take some time actually because we also have posted some transactions for this vendor earlier. So for on all those records as well as in the backend tables everywhere, it will erase this number and give this number, new number for the vendor. So that it will take a little time. So if I go back to the accounts payable parameters under the number sequences, I have here vendor account. So this number sequence will guide you how you can number your vendors. So if I open this number sequence, it will be in default format like REL and 60 digits. You can remove the company name from here, give a constant value as vendor, right? So that's what we have given, vendor. So now you can see this is renamed already as vendor 0000001 Tata company. It is renamed properly. Now you can give it the same vendor 000001. You can give the next number as 2 because 1 is already there, right? We have already manually named it as 1, so you can give it as 2. Suppose if you don't select continuous, if you select manual here means you can manually give the number. So I'll show you that one as well. See, for now I'm saving this one. I gave this format as vendor on 6 digits and then I gave next number is 2 on continuous. Okay, I'll just go back and save it here in the parameters. Now I'll go to all vendors. I'll create a new vendor. As soon as I create a new vendor, I can see vendor 000002 is picked up automatically. So auto numbering. If you are using continuous means it will take this number. Now it is asking you vendor name, which is a compulsory field to be filled, and vendor group is a compulsory field to be filled. Other than this, we don't have any compulsory field. We have one as currency, but that will be by default field actually, currency field. for the vendor. It will take the accounting currency by default. If it is a foreign vendor, you can manually change the currency. So this is what we have here in to be filled. So you can give the name to the vendor. So please suggest the name of the vendor, guys. Anyone? What name we can give for this vendor? So General Electric. So I can group this vendor as a foreign vendor because GE's main office is somewhere in US or Canada. So I can select it as a foreign vendor. Suppose General Electric. And I can save this. As soon as I save this, I'll see the number here. It's new record now. It will change it accordingly. Now I see vendor 002 General Electric. So General Electric is the new vendor that they created. See, we have a lot of other details that has to be filled in. I'll I'll explain every key detail that we have to discuss in the, I mean, further, not today. We'll just create vendor records today. And since after completing the configuration and then when we discuss all these things, again, I'll come back to explain you about the vendor menu, credit limits and defaults and everything within the vendor master. So we have certain things here, as in you can see. Where is this currency field that I was looking for? Here it is. You can see the currency. So if it is a domestic or local vendor, you can give your own accounting currency. If you feel like it is a foreign vendor, so it's a compulsory field. If you feel like it is a foreign vendor and you will work with a different currency with this vendor, you can give a different currency like Canadian dollar. Suppose that's it will work. So whenever you create any invoice or payment for this vendor, mostly it will take the Canadian dollar currency into the transaction currency. Okay, that's how. So let this vendor be a domestic vendor. Oh, sorry, a foreign vendor. Now I have two vendors, Tata Company and General Electric. So group number 1 and 2 I have C. You can always filter the vendors by your group. So what are the list of vendors that you have under one group? You can give the group filter here. Come on. So you can filter them like domestic vendors 01. So you can see here 01. You will see all the list of vendors in 01 group or domestic vendors list, and you can also export them if you want to. You can generally use this export option that we all most of the times used. This is one way. Let me clear the filter, clear it. Then what we can do is, what else we can do is, so let's see this option of manually numbering the vendors. So I'll just open this number sequence again. Suppose I'll change it back. So next number it is showing as 3 because 2 is generated now. So I'll stop this as continuous, okay, and I'll keep it as manual for the time being. If it is manual means this will be grayed out. There is no use of this at all. So I just saved it as manual and save. Now if I go and create a vendor, suppose in the vendor menu, accounts payable. So here I see there is no number for the vendor. Come on, I should get a option to edit the vendor name, but I'm not getting it to. Not sure why. Let me delete this. So I have two vendors. Okay, let me go back and reopen the form. In this number sequence, just gave it as manual. Okay, and nothing. Then save these parameters too. Then go back to vendors again, accounts payable, all vendors. Then I can click on new vendor. Now I can see it. It was a refresh issue, I think. I can see the field empty. Normally it should take vendor double 000003, right? But it doesn't took that code. You can enter your manual code. So when you are When you are dividing the vendor numbers on group wise, you can create as so. It's your wish, or if you want to give separate number for the local vendors like LOC vendor 000 001, so you can give it. So you would always ask your users to follow the same when they are creating the vendor details. The same format. The next number when you create in the local vendors will be LOC vendor 000 002. So it will not man. So when you are using manual options like this, you have to do this one. Okay. Or if you use that automatic option, it will automatically give you the vendor number. But for all the groups of vendors, you will get the same number. The practice that they do in business is that they will have an Excel file in which through which they can import the vendor names. Actually, in that they'll number the vendors according to their group, and then they'll mostly use the manual option only in the number sequence, and they will manually enter the numbers for the vendors. Group wise, they'll maintain the number sequences, but here I'm not maintaining as so. I'll again keep it continuous. Uh, Here I'll change it from manual to continuous again. Okay, and save it and go back and save it and close the form and refresh it. Then I'll create a new vendor here. So vendor number 3 I can see here automatically taken. Then I can give a name for this vendor. So what name will give for this vendor? Let me say that. So the very famous Nika products. In the Reliance store, we sell the Nika product, so we will normally procure it from the Nika itself directly, and we'll sell it in Reliance. Let's suppose if you want to give any group, you can give any group here, like local vendor. If you want to give, you can give, or domestic, you can give your wish. I'm just giving it as local vendor here. Okay, and I'll go back. So these are the three vendors that I have created in this list. Vendor number 1, 2, and 3. Both are in sequence, and they belong to three different groups. Actually, you can create multiple vendors also if you want to. Then the details of the vendors will fill all those things later, and we can see the default currency for these vendors. And I can create one more if I want to. So NSL India will buy NS goods from NSL India for our Reliance textile purpose. So I'll give that name as NSL India, and I'll call it as local vendor even. Okay, and save it. If I go back, then I can see the list again. So number 3 and 4. So both of them fall into local vendors. Other two are domestic and foreign. Okay. So this is how we have this, creation of vendors. So other than this, the next class, let us discuss it in the next class itself. The vendor posting profiles and invoice journals. Okay. Or if vendor posting profiles is a very important concept. I don't want to explain you in a hurry now, since we only have 5 minutes. Tomorrow, let us discuss posting profile, and then we'll discuss about invoice journals. So after creating this tool, then we'll come to these setups, and we can try to apply all these setups on the invoices. So without knowing how they would function, I can roughly explain you, and later also I can imply it to the invoice journals. But I thought like I would better start with the invoice journals. Later I can come back to this all the configurations. We'll do step by step all of them, and we will link them to the invoices so that you can better understand how they are functioning. So we'll do that in that manner this time. So other than this, we'll discuss about this one, vendor reasons. So since we have time for 5 minutes, so it's a very small concept, vendor reasons. Again, as I told you, the details in the vendor and all the details in the vendor here, we'll discuss all of them again. Once I'll discuss all these concepts, we'll come back to that point of vendor master discussion. Okay, for now I will start with vendor reasons. So you can give reason codes like in any other module. In the accounts payable module also, you can give reason codes. It will be here under setup, accounts payable, setup, vendor reasons you have here. So you can create accounts payable, setup, and vendor reasons. So there were some reasons which were linked to the vendor already here. No, you can create few other reasons if you want to, only specific to the vendors or specific to accounts payable module. Okay. Anything you can create. Credit note journal. You can say something. So you can create any other things if you want within the vendors. Reason codes. These are the financial reason codes we have created in general ledger module, also in the bank module where we have linked the vendors as well. So these are applicable for the vendors too. So it's up to you how you can create your reason codes, as many as you want for your vendors too. You can use the reason codes for any other reversals or any other situations in business. Cannot, I mean, uh, you can design your reason codes as you wish depending upon the business and the situation. That uh, that would be all mostly for today's class.